Josef Fritzl. Josef Fritzl was a strict father, a product he would claim of the Nazi controlled Third Reich in which he grew up, but a good one, or so it seemed. An electrical engineer, he lived with his wife Rosemary in their normal provincial townhouse, the small Austrian town of Amstetten, where they brought up their 7 children. But behind closed doors, he was a manipulative sociopath, driven to exert his power over others, patriarchal or otherwise, at any cost. In fact, he had already served a prison sentence back in 1967 for raping a woman at knife point, a conviction which, conveniently for him, had been wiped from his record 15 years later in accordance with Austrian law. It was this mixture of outward respectability, fierce domination, and legal loopholes that allowed the so called monster of. So, this name is, I need to pronounce it correctly because it's part of the main character's persona. So, it's T. How do you pronounce this thing?
Amstetten.
Amstetten, the monster of Amstetten, to continue his reign of terror for nearly a quarter of a century. It was a horror story that was to ignite an international media
Furor.
furor, furor,
Furor. Furor.
furor, an international media furor, and sent shockwaves through local and national communities alike. Elizabeth Fritzl was only 11 years old when her father's sexual abuse began. As she entered her teens, she began to revel. She began to revel. I don't know how to pronounce that as well. I need to confess it.
Rebel.
Revel. She began to revel, staying out till the small hours and drinking and smoking in bars. Staying out till the small hours, and drinking and smoking in bars. She was stubborn and strong-willed to boot, which Fritzl didn't like one bit. He would later explain. That is why I had to do something. I had to create a place where I could keep Elizabeth, by force if necessary, away from the outside world. By the time she was by the time she was 18 and no more disposed towards obedience, Fritzl had done just that. In fact, his meticulous planning of the kidnap and incarceration of his daughter had begun years in advance. He had built a secret basement and converted it into a prison cell up to 3 years earlier. Kitted out with just a wash basin, toilet, bed, hot plate, and refrigerator, the dank, windowless dungeon. Dank, windowless dungeon was no luxury apartment. Oh no. Fritzl had the useful foresight to soundproof the 35 square meters area and install huge electronically locking doors weighing up to 500 kilograms, which he hid behind shelves in his basement workshop. Total of 8 doors needed to be unlocked to reach the innermost cells. Clearly, Fritzl's plans were well laid to the last detail. Useful foresight to soundproof. Okay. There we are. We are going to continue reading this piece. This piece of text. On 29 August 1984, Fritzl lured Elizabeth into the basement, drugged her with ether, and locked her in the tiny concealed cellar. It would mark the last time in 24 years Elizabeth would see daylight. Upstairs, Fritzl told his wife Rosemary that their daughter had run away to join a religious sect. It was not entirely beyond belief. Elizabeth had already run away from her unhappy, abusive home twice before. Submissive Rosemary accepted her husband's explanation without question. Elizabeth's father would visit the cellar regularly, once every 3 days or so, to bring food and supplies, and before long, to have sex with his captive daughter, sometimes using chains to prevent her struggling. Over the course of her imprisonment, Elizabeth was raped an estimated 3,000 times. Unsurprisingly, it was not long before she was impregnated. The first pregnancy miscarried. The second resulted in the birth of Kirsten in 1989. Between 1989 and 2002, Fritzl fathered 7 of his daughter's children. One child, Michael, died 3 days after birth. When Fritzl saw the baby struggling to breathe, he told his anguished daughter, "What will be," and went upstairs to eat his dinner. After the baby's death, he incinerated the body in a stove in his cellar. Of the 6 surviving children, 3 remained with Elizabeth in the basement. The other 3 seemingly picked up random. Fritzl took upstairs one by one at birth and left them on the doorstep of his own house, each time with a note from Elizabeth to express her wish for Rosemary to bring them up. Once again, no questions were asked by family, friends, or indeed the state. The upstairs children, fostered and later adopted by Josef and Rosemary, were intelligent and well adjusted, oblivious to their mother and siblings living beneath them in tiny dark quarters, threatened with gassing and electrocution if they tried to escape, and ruled by fear of and dependence on their despotic father. And so might Fritzl's terrifying domination have continued, but for Kirsten's sudden illness in April 2008, a desperate Elizabeth begged her father to allow the critically ill and unconscious 19-year-old to be removed from the cellar and taken to hospital for treatment. Fritzl agreed, explaining on arrival to sympathetic doctors that Kirsten had been left on his doorstep in this condition by his errant absentee daughter. A week later, he even allowed Elizabeth a hospital visit to Kirsten, who had been diagnosed with kidney failure. Local police, acting on a tip-off, brought Elizabeth in for questioning. It was only after assurances she would never have to lay eyes on her father again that she began to reveal the horrific details of her captivity. The ordeal was at last over, but the aftermath continues. The three downstairs children suffered vitamin D deficiency, anemia, illiteracy, agoraphobia, and countless other issues linked to their incarceration. The three upstairs children must come to terms with the breakdown of their adoptive family, their new relationship with their mother, and the guilt that they did not suffer the traumas of those underground. All six are at high risk of genetic disease generated by incest from which they were born. All have been given new identities. Life for the Fritzls will never again be normal. It took a jury just 3.5 days to find Josef Fritzl guilty of murder, rape, enslavement, and incest. During the trial, the court heard that he knew he was born to rape and chose Elizabeth of his 7 children as his victim because she was most like me. She was as stubborn as me, as strong as me. The stronger your opponent, the bigger the victory. When the 73-year-old was handed his life sentence, it seemed he had accepted that the remainder of his life would be spent firmly under lock and key. It is perhaps a fitting end for the tyrant who subjected his family to the same fate for so many years. His cell, though, had the luxury of a window. What do you think of that? Pretty scary, right? And a nightmare for that people. Contemporary philosophy, 1950 present. Okay, now we are going to read some philosophy for you. Yeah. Thank you for being back there in such a huge numbers. So let me read about philosophy a bit. There you go. Excellent. Let's start with this. The closing decades of the 20th century were notable for accelerating advances in technology and the subsequent improvement in communications of all kinds. The increasing power of the mass media, especially television since the end of World War II, had fueled the rise in popular culture with its associated anti-establishment ideals. And this in turn was promoting political and social change. From the 1960s onwards, the old order was being questioned in Europe and the US, and dissent gathered momentum in Eastern Europe. By the 1980s, relations between the East and West were thawing. And the Cold War was coming to a close. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 offered hope for the new decade. But the 1990s was a period of ethnic and religious unrest, culminating in the US declaring a war on terror at the start of the new millennium. Elitist philosophies, culture in the West went through similarly significant changes. The gap between popular and high culture widened after the 1960s, as the intellectual avant-garde often decided to disregard public taste. Philosophy followed a similarly elitist path, particularly after the death of Jean-Paul Sartre, whose Marx now had less of an audience. Continental philosophy was dominated in the 1970s and 80s by structuralism, a movement that grew from literature-based French philosophy. Central to this movement was the notion of deconstructing texts and revealing them to be inherently unstable, with many contradictory meanings. The theory's principal proponents, French theorists Louis Althusser, Jacques Derrida, and Michel Foucault, linked their textual analysis with the left-wing politics, while the analyst Jacques Lacan gave structuralism a psychoanalytic perspective. Their ideas were soon taken up by a generation of writers and artists working under the banner of postmodernism, which rejected all possibility of a single objective truth, viewpoint, or narrative. Structuralism's contribution to philosophy was not enthusiastically received by philosophers in the English speaking world, who viewed the work at best suspicion and largely with derision. Within a philosophical tradition of linguistic analysis, continental structuralism seemed ultimately simplistic, although it was often written in impenetrable prose that belied its literary roots. The squabbles of philosophers did not inspire the popular culture of the time. This may have been because postmodernism was largely incomprehensible to the general public. Their most common experience of it was postmodern art, which was highly conceptual and accompanied by knowing references by an intellectual elite. It seemed to deliberately exclude any possibility of mass appreciation and became seen as an abstract philosophy only enjoyed by professional academics and artists, and out of touch with the world most people lived in. The public, as well as businesses and governments, wanted more down to earth guidance from philosophy, a more practical approach. A more practical approach. Though postmodern philosophy may not have found favor with the majority of the general public, some philosophers of the period chose to focus on more pressing social, political, and ethical questions that had more relevance to people's everyday lives. Thinkers in post-colonial Africa, such as Franz Fanon, began to examine race, identity, and the problems that were inherent in any struggle for liberation. Later thinkers, such as Henry Odera Uruka, would begin to amass a new history of African philosophy, questioning the rules governing philosophy itself and what it should include. Oh, Leslie, thank you. Thank you for your support. What else do we have here? Philosophers Hélène Cixous and Lucy Irigaray added a postmodern perspective to Simone de Beauvoir's existential feminist philosophy, but others left postmodernism to one side. Many focused less on abstract concepts and instead on practical matters of justice and morality. John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas, for example, explored how society might be better organized. Bell Hooks linked various forms of oppression on grounds of race, gender, or sexual orientation to a dominant capitalist patriarchy, while Philippa Foot and Bernard Williams challenged the assumptions of modern ethics. Meanwhile, as Thomas Nagel and Daniel Dennett explored human consciousness, rapid advances in the science of artificial intelligence revived the question, can machines think? Let's take a look at this timeline here. I don't know if you can see it clearly. Let me adjust the camera for you. Let me do this for you. There you go. I'm doing it for you. And what do we have here? 1952, Frantz Fanon publishes Black Skin, White Masks. 1953, Simone de Beauvoir publishes her groundbreaking feminist work, The Second Sex. The Vietnam War begins. The USSR and China support communist North Vietnam, while the USA supports South Vietnam. 1961, here, the Berlin Wall is constructed, dividing East and West Germany until its fall in 1989. Thomas Kuhn publishes The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. 1964, the Civil Rights Act, 1964, becomes law in the USA, prohibiting discrimination by race. China's Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution purges China of everything Western, capitalist, traditionalist, or religious. 1967, Jacques Derrida, the founder of deconstruction, publishes Writing and Difference. And now here we are. The non-government environment agency Greenpeace is formed in Canada, evolving from peace movements and anti-nuclear groups. 1971. 1979, Jean-François Lyotard publishes The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge. 1980, Exploring Artificial Intelligence, AI, John Searle makes the distinction between strong AI and weak AI. 1989, many European states overthrow their communist regimes, including Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Bulgaria, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. The World Wide Web in 1992 opens up to home and personal use. 1994, Henry Odera Oruka publishes Sage Philosophy. 2013, a number of unlawful killings of Black Americans triggers the Black Lives Matter movement. 2017, the hashtag #MeToo movement emerges as a reaction to continued high-profile sexual harassment. Well, that was the introduction for contemporary philosophy, and I will hope to see you next time to read about Roland Barthes. I hope you liked this episode because it's gonna be more coming on. And so thank you so much for being back there. Talk to you tomorrow.